The North York Moors National Park, established in 1952, spans some 554 square miles of upland terrain across North Yorkshire in northern England. The park has a landscape consisting of sweeping heather-covered moorland, covering more than a third of the park. It has some deep valleys, densely wooded dales, and dramatic cliffs along the coast. Because of its scale and remoteness in places, the park is known for its wide open views, rich wildlife, and on the very rare occasion, missing persons. Prior to the 11th of November in 2015, when he would come to disappear, Stephen Gibson was known in his community as an active and experienced hiker, as well as a hunter. He lived in the village of Terrington, which is nestled in the Howardian Hills area, not far from Malton. This is a naturally beautiful area of rolling countryside that is well wooded. Presumably, growing up in this area is what led to Stephen's hobby of exploration, and we know that he had spent much of his life exploring the region's trails. At the time of his disappearance, Stephen was 73 years old, and while he was getting on in life, he had managed to remain remarkably fit for his age. The authorities described him as a regular walker who knew the area well, which was probably a slight understatement given just how long he'd been hiking this area. His familiarity with the national park stemmed from years of traversing its paths, like those on Spaunton Moor, a high plateau covered in heather bilberries, grassland, and interspersed with peat bogs that can be treacherous if caught out in terrible weather. At this time, Stephen was a pensioner, enjoying his retirement. At some point, he had got involved with the Ampleforth Beagles, a hunting group, and he became the treasurer, presumably handling the finances for the group. This is an important fact because most outlets reported that when Stephen vanished, he was out walking with a group. Which I suppose he was in some way, but rather he was actually out hunting at the time when this happened. Stephen was dressed appropriately for the cold, and he was also wearing waterproof gear, though he did not take food or a tent, as this was not supposed to be an overnight trip. So, on the morning of Wednesday the 11th of November in 2015, Stephen set out with his fellow hunters for a trek in the Rosedale area of the North York Moors. Rosedale is a deep dale carved into the moorland with a lot of now unused mining sites, as a lot of ironstone extraction used to take place there. The group's route through Rosedale focused on Spaunton Moor, which is a section of open moorland lying between the villages of Lastingham to the south and to the top of Rosedale Chimney Bank to the north. Chimney Bank itself is a notoriously steep road, having a 33% gradient, which is one of the steepest in England. At 4 PM on the day in question, Stephen was last seen walking along a path that connects Chimney Bank and Lastingham. They were on a well-established path, though you still need to be careful as it traverses featureless heather moorland, which is prone to boggy patches. As the afternoon progressed, the group continued their way along the path. As they were walking, daylight began to fade and sunset was around 4:15 PM in mid-November. Rather suddenly, and aligning with the sunset, a thick fog descended over Spaunton Moor and blanketed the area where the group were walking. While perhaps surprising at how quickly they all became engulfed by it, the fog is actually a common hazard in the moors during this season, exacerbated by the park's elevation and proximity to the North Sea. The moist air can blanket the landscape in minutes, reducing visibility to near zero, and it can come very quickly without warning. It was under these conditions that Stephen became separated from the rest of his group. The exact moment of separation isn't fully understood, but it's believed that he lagged behind the others and somehow seemed to have veered off the main track, perhaps being disoriented by the fog. The rest of the group continued, presumably not noticing and thinking that everyone was still accounted for. Interestingly, the rest of the group never reported hearing anything, so it doesn't appear that Stephen called out to them. Perhaps he did, though it would have had to have been after he was well and truly separated and much further away from them. It could be that he didn't call out initially to try to relocate the others, because he just didn't realise that he'd started to veer away from them. It's very unfortunate that nobody else had noticed, because Spaunton Moors were already covered by the fog, and then also completely enveloped by the darkness at 5 PM. The rest of the hunters waited by their cars, though I'm not sure where exactly. They could have been parked in either Lastingham or somewhere between Chimney Road and Rosedale. I'd imagine on the Chimney Road, because hunting with dogs is very much frowned upon in England. It's also illegal actually, as a result of the Hunting Act in 2004. I don't understand the weeds of it, but it seems as though there might be some loopholes. In any case, the point being is that they might have parked here and were then dropped off by someone else at Lastingham to make their way back north. Or they just parked up here and then went on a circular route. The path is only 3 miles long, so there are a few possibilities there. But either way, by 7 PM, the rest of the group, now at their cars, heard absolutely nothing from Stephen and they called the authorities. Before we go any further, if I could just ask you to like the video and hype it, then I would be very grateful. And please consider turning on notifications for the channel and subscribing if you haven't already. North Yorkshire Police were notified, and they quickly realised how serious this was, as overnight the temperatures can hover around freezing at this time of the year. They initially wondered if he might have been injured, though this will have had to have been much after the separation, since nobody had heard him call out. Officers, who were equipped with torches, came out and followed the path that the group had taken, but they found nothing. Soon after this, and still on the same evening, the Scarborough and Rydale Mountain Rescue Team were mobilised. They essentially did the same thing as the immediate police search, though were able to cover a larger area as the numbers grew. Interestingly, they just could not find a trace of Stephen anywhere. They didn't find any footprints or anything like that to insinuate a direction of travel. Although it will have been very dark, and visibility was already low with the fog. He didn't respond to any of their calls at any point. I suppose by this time, it will have been anywhere from 5 hours or more after he was last seen, so he could have made some good distance during that time. As said, by all accounts, he was very fit for his age, so I suppose he must have, or they would have found him there and then. I believe that there was an ongoing search over the night, because the search leaders realised that without any supplies, hypothermia was a very real possibility in the cold, damp moorland. The following day on the 12th, marked the first full day of intensive searching. By 7:30 AM, the area was now light enough to expand the search, though it was still very foggy with overcast skies. The Scarborough and Rydale team led the search effort and coordinated with the police, who gave them access to more resources. They had deployed thermal imaging cameras over the area looking for a heat signature, but found nothing other than the ground searchers who were looking. Both Cleveland and Swaledale mountain rescue teams entered the search and began a methodical grid search from Lastingham northward to Chimney Bank and tried to retrace the group's steps. 9 specialised search and rescue dogs were brought in from the Search and Rescue Dogs Association and the Lake District Mountain Search Rescue Dogs. If you watch my videos a lot, you must think that these dogs are absolutely useless because in the cases I cover, usually they just cannot find the person's scent. But this is not the case. There is a good reason that we've been using these dogs in a search and rescue capacity for hundreds of years. In a lot of wilderness disappearances, the dogs are the ones that often break the deadlock when everything else has failed. Even if they don't find the missing person outright, perhaps because of a body of water or something like that, they usually give an indication as to where the person has been or where they may have entered the water. Various studies have shown that these trained dogs have a success rate of between 75 and 85%, though I've seen even higher numbers than that cited, depending on the location and conditions. In particularly bad conditions, this can significantly decrease just how effective they are. In this instance, there will have been a higher humidity given the fog. In higher humidity situations, their effectiveness can be decreased as they have a higher rate of false positives. Or in other words, the dogs believe that they have found a scent and they signal it to their handlers, but then the scent leads nowhere. So I'd imagine in this situation, it would have negatively affected the dogs, since in foggy conditions, you'd expect humidity to be very high, somewhere between 70% and 100%. So, given the high general success rate, when the dogs find absolutely nothing at all, I can see why some people find it unusual. Though in this instance, they would have had a harder time and likely would have caught onto a scent that wasn't Stephen's. I'm speculating a bit though, because I couldn't find any mention of the dogs ever having found a scent in this case. In any case, the dogs were placed at the position he was last seen along the path, and they fanned out alongside the other ground searchers. They went along the main track across the moor, and then side paths leading into the Rosedale area. There were questions as to whether he might have made his way to Anna's Cross where he took shelter, but I don't really see how this would have provided shelter. The rescuers had been absolutely drenched that day as the rain just kept pouring, and they all realised that this was very likely to have meant hypothermia if Stephen hadn't managed to find some sort of shelter somewhere. By midday, the RAF also got involved and made passes overhead while placing their own Leeming Mountain rescue team on the ground to cover the more remote and dangerous sections. The search effort really was incredible in this instance. A lot of resources were poured into trying to bring Stephen home, but nothing was working, and they just couldn't find him anywhere. Despite over 20 hours worth of searching, there were no signs anywhere, no clothing, footprints, or even calls had emerged. I'd imagine that a phone signal around Spaunton Moors would have been fairly poor and unreliable in 2015. Although it probably depends on the provider too. I lose signal walking down my own street sometimes. Another point to consider is that if he had started to suffer from hypothermia at some point, as has well been covered on this channel, it leaves a person in a really dire state of confusion. It starts mild, but over time that confusion just gets worse and worse until eventually decision making becomes essentially nonsensical. So there is a possibility that he found himself in that state before he was in an area that might have had a connection. By nightfall, fatigue was setting in, but the operations continued under floodlights, so the teams began to rotate so they could rest the people that had been out there non-stop. On the 13th, the search entered its second full day and had now surpassed 30 hours since the disappearance. It was still raining and had become even colder. Dogs were redeployed and there were more sweeps through the air, but still no signs were found whatsoever. Things would change on the 14th, 3 days into the search operation. Around mid-morning, Stephen's body was found near Cropton in a forested area. It is not clear precisely where the discovery was made, though sources state that it was near Cropton and east of Lastingham, so likely around this approximate area. It's difficult to say for certain, although at some point he must have crossed one of the paths that run through the moors and then the grassy area, so it's a shame that he didn't follow them. Even if you don't know where a path goes, just following it is inevitably going to lead you somewhere. I saw some discussion about how people felt that this disappearance was odd, and a couple of reasons were cited. First up was the fact that he just vanished so suddenly while trailing behind the others, and nobody noticed. I think that's fair. It is a little unusual that perhaps nobody saw or heard anything, and that he seemingly hadn't tried to call out to his friends. That aspect actually reminds me of the Palmer brothers case that I covered last week. I'll leave a link to that in the top right now and in the description below if you want to open a new tab. But ultimately, both Michael and Charles vanished separately and 11 years apart under strangely similar circumstances. Both of them had lagged behind their respective group and both disappeared without a trace. In their cases, unlike this one, no remains were ever found, whereas Stephen's was days later. Another comment raised surprise that the aerial components of the search, specifically the thermal imaging equipped helicopters, failed to locate him. It's a valid point. In theory, you'd think that in thermal view, someone either laying injured or walking across the cold moorland would have been fairly obvious, and a heat signature would have been as clear as day, yet that didn't happen. The only explanation I can really think of to explain that is where he ended up. Since he was found within a wooded area, the canopy would have obscured him almost completely from above. If he had left the trail early after accidentally separating and continued on directly southeast, he would have eventually have crossed into that dense forest section. I suppose, because he was not found by the thermal imaging cameras, it seems to me that you actually do have to argue that he did in fact reach that wooded area sometime in the evening after he disappeared, or sometime after midnight, or else he would have been found wandering. The decision, or perhaps more likely the misjudgment to leave the trail, is what raises so many questions here. The path that he was originally walking on stands out dramatically against the surrounding moorland, even in the overcast light. In fog, everyone else could still see the path, so it could have been that in Stephen's advanced age, perhaps his eyesight just wasn't as good as it used to be. I don't know that for sure, though it is a little surprising that he deviated from the main trail. You'd also feel the change in ground texture beneath your boots, from compacted soil and stone compared to soft, uneven heather and peat. So even if he couldn't see the path perfectly well, it still should have been obvious that you've just left it onto the surrounding vegetation. It seems difficult to make sense of that because when they separated, they hadn't lost the light at that time, although they were about to. I could imagine that being much easier perhaps an hour or so after the point he was last seen in total darkness. In any case, the point being is that to step off the path whenever he did, and to continue onwards into the moorland, suggests to me a deeper level of confusion or disorientation. That does check out with hypothermia, though I would have expected that to have become a problem later during the night, and not when they first separated. Perhaps under those conditions, the area is just even more brutally deceptive than I'm imagining, even if on a main path. After all, it's not unheard of for a hiker to get completely turned around in thick fog and heading in circles, while being convinced they're going straight forwards. As you'll notice, if he did continue southeast, he would have had to have crossed the two other major paths, both of which are very clear and obvious breaks in the heather. Perhaps with the thick fog, and at some point total darkness, he just can't have realised that he'd crossed them. When the rest of the group were at the cars at 7 PM, he could have been beyond the paths. If that is the case that he entered the forest area on the 11th, and suffered from hypothermia, that would explain why the helicopters and the cameras never saw anything. It'd be much easier to spot a person out in the open moorland than it would be in a forested area. Hypothermia really does seem like the only plausible factor here. I'm not sure when it would have set in, but it impairs reasoning and decision making to a very large degree. People just stop making purposeful decisions, and as said, things become more nonsensical and confusion gets worse. I don't believe this happened here, but some people who reach the end stages of hypothermia start to remove clothing as a result of paradoxical undressing, and then they wander aimlessly, totally unaware of what's happening. If that process had begun, specifically the confusion aspect, it could explain why Stephen never turned back and didn't follow any of the paths out, instead just walking right across them, and ultimately ending up in a patch of woodland far from where he was last seen. It's also worth noting that we don't actually know a cause of passing in this instance. No inquest details or official cause has ever been released publicly. I don't think I've ever come across another disappearance where that has been the case. Typically, even brief inquest summaries appear in local records. Even if the disappearance has an obvious explanation, usually you'll hear that hypothermia or some such thing was suspected. Do you think Stephen's disappearance was as a result of hypothermia? Do let me know. I thought that this incident in particular was worth highlighting, because people often underestimate how dangerous national parks can be in the UK. In America, for example, the area is certainly far more vast and unforgiving, but hypothermia doesn't really care where you are, if that's even what happened at all. On that note though, that's about all of the information that I could find, so I suppose that brings us to the end of this. I hope that you don't mind the shorter episode this week. This is past me speaking, but current me has been away for the week and wanted to make sure that something was still up on the channel. So I just didn't quite have the time to research another case from scratch. Anyway, please do remember to subscribe and turn on notifications for the channel, and also to like the video and hype it if you can. I'd appreciate that very much. Or a dislike if you disliked it. I'm happy to hear your opinion either way. I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a really big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Be safe all. Peace.